A long, long time ago, the world was in an age of chaos. In the midst of this chaos, in a little kingdom in the land of Hyrule, a legend was being handed down from generation to generation. The legend of the Triforce. Golden triangles possessing mystical powers. Golden triangles? Are you serious? That's the legend? Anyway, let's keep going. One day, an evil army attacked this peaceful little kingdom and stole the Triforce of Power. This army was led by Ganon, the powerful Prince of Darkness who sought to plunge the world into fear and darkness under his rule. And it was from that simple legend that spawned one of Nintendo's biggest franchises, a cultural phenomenon, and a really complicated and confusing timeline. But most importantly, it pioneered the adventure genre for decades to come. So welcome my friends to the troubled world of Hyrule! Hey everyone, and welcome to Nintendo 101, where I go over any game from Nintendo's past and show the print it left on the gaming industry, no matter how terrible that print may be. I'm looking at you. I'm Balrog, your professor, and today we're going to go over what exactly makes The Legend of Zelda on NES so special. But before we can do that, we gotta travel back to the past. 1976 to be exact, where video games were... oh boy. So, let's get started. So our story begins on a mainframe computer known as the PDP-10, with a small title called Colossal Cave Adventure. Riveting, I know. Now despite being text only, this game essentially created the adventure genre all those years ago, allowing players to move freely and solve the mysteries of the cave on their own. The game setting was even based on an actual cavern, Mammoth Cave, so if you happen to be a seasoned spelunker and gamer, you could actually navigate the place on your first try. Except there's a talking plant and a dwarf throws an axe. What? But you know, you're probably thinking, what does this all have to do with Zelda, and why am I starting all the way at the beginning of adventure games? Well, a few years later, a man named Warren Robinette tasked himself with the ultimate challenge, porting this fancy cave thing to the Atari 2600, a home console. Now if that sounds crazy to you, that's because it should. This sounded almost impossible on paper. Turning a text-based game into a graphical one? Even his boss was like, that ain't happening, man, and told him it was just impossible to do. But despite all odds, Adventure was released in 1979 and sold over 1 million copies, something extremely rare for games at that time. So what do you do in this wildly successful game exactly? Are there any plants begging for water this time? Well, as expected, Robinette took a lot of liberties with this premise. The point of Adventure is to get a chalice back to a golden castle, and you do so by completing a bunch of mazes and slaying some dragons. Okay, that's not even close to a dragon. Is that like an ostrich or something? It's very simple, hence why you're a square, but it had a lot of groundbreaking features for the time. The first Easter egg in a game, which was the creator's name, you gotta start somewhere, right? A continue feature if you die, holding items without 1 million text commands, and difficulty levels, including one that even randomizes the location of items. It's just awesome, and it gives the game replay value even after you beat it the first time. And thanks to all this, Adventure would eventually go on to be the foundation of graphical RPGs and, you guessed it, action-adventure games, though a lot of them failed to capture the same success. But one day, Adventure would influence 2 aspiring game developers in Japan, to the point that they wanted to make their own version. So, let's talk about them, shall we? Alright, so back in the mid-1980s, Takashi Tezuka and Shigeru Miyamoto were both part of Nintendo's creative department. Miyamoto had already designed several successful Famicom games, or NES games outside of Japan, such as Excitebike, Ice Climber, and Devil World. In fact, Devil World was also the first game Tezuka made with Nintendo, though Devil World never came to North America for obvious reasons. So as you could guess, after they worked on this project together, these guys were pretty close and actually still develop games together to this day. For better or for worse. But their next 2 projects, now known as Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda, had a completely different development process. These 2 games were to be made simultaneously, and be created as total opposites, going as far to call gameplay ideas Zelda ideas and Mario ideas. Super Mario Bros. Was meant to be a more linear and scripted action game, with a trade of high scores and jumping and, shrooms. While The Legend of Zelda, originally just called Adventure, see where I'm going with this, was made to be more open world and really make the player think about where to go or strategize their next move. Heck, Mario was even designed to be the Famicom swan song, while Zelda was the first game developed for the Famicom Disk System, a new peripheral for the console that was mainly created for more memory. And an extra music channel. But just calling The Legend of Zelda an open-world adventure game doesn't do the game justice at all. Miyamoto didn't just want to expand on adventure, he wanted to create a miniature garden that players could put inside their drawer. He wanted players to experience the exploring he did as a child, going through fields, woods, and caves. And most importantly, he based the dungeons on the maze of sliding doors in his old house. I couldn't make this stuff up if I tried. but the lengths that Miyamoto took to realize this dream were quite harsh. While Tezuka was in charge of making the story and setting, Miyamoto was getting people in Japan to test the prototype, and players had no idea what they were doing. Dungeons had multiple paths in the game, the enemy patterns were difficult, and a lot of people just complained that they were getting lost. But instead of listening to those criticisms, Miyamoto took the sword away from them, forcing players to work together to solve these puzzles. Now, as mean as it sounds, this kind of communication actually helped pioneer the way we think about games today, with more recent ways being online message boards, Nintendo's social network known as Miiverse, or heck, just getting your friends to help you out. But still, I would have hated to be those game testers. Now, as for the game itself, there were a lot of changes from the beta version to the final version. For starters, the Armos enemies, these statue guys that just kinda go nuts when you touch them, come to life twice as fast. Some of the enemies' health points and attack damages were doubled, and on top of that, you originally had a choice between the boomerang or a sword at the beginning of the game, but was changed to only the sword. Almost all these changes were to make the game harder, so we can only assume who was responsible. But despite all that, when all these elements came together, we got one of the best action-adventure games ever made. So it's time to see what this game's all about. Alright, so the plot here is pretty simple. As I said at the beginning of the video, Ganon steals a Triforce of Power so he can rule the world. However, in order to complete this task, he must also obtain the Triforce of Wisdom, which Zelda conveniently broke and hid in 8 different dungeons. After she gets kidnapped by Ganon, or Ganon in the original text, which is all in broken English by the way, ones who does not have the Triforce can't go. No, it's not done. Her nursemaid Impa has to find someone brave enough to get these golden triangles and save Hyrule, which ends up being you, Link. So now you have to go through 8 different dungeons for the fragments and defeat Ganon on Death Mountain in a final battle. Now this may not sound like much today, but having lore and backstory in a game was pretty rare back then, unless they made some crap up on the box. The young knight, Jim, has a tough challenge. He must avenge the death of his king and save Princess Anne? Oh boy. It gives you a purpose to beat the game, rather than being some random dude doing random things to save some random world. So anyway, let's talk about the gameplay itself, and what better place to start than the very first screen in the game. Now whether it seems like it or not, this one screen changed the way we thought about adventure games forever. So if you'll notice at the top of the screen, the game immediately tells you what buttons do what. And right now you only have a shield without any way to attack. Before this game came out, a lot of action RPGs started you out with a sword, so where's the sword? Well, luckily there's a blatantly obvious cave in the corner here, so when you stroll on in and go inside, guess what? The wizard gives you a sword. So from this little encounter alone, you've learned the following things. A. You're weak as hell without a weapon. B. If you go in caves, you'll find tons of cool stuff, so you should definitely go in all of them. And C. You know the button layout of the entire game. Now back in 1986, this didn't happen very often. Adventure games almost always required you to read a manual or struggle with the game until you learned the mechanics, but Zelda lays its rules to you clear as day, and because of that, the game almost always feels difficult while still being fair. But Miyamoto didn't just stop there. Just like he envisioned, the game's exactly like that miniature garden, in which it allows you to play the way you want to play. Want to explore? No problem, just slay some enemies, get some rupees, or I don't know. Buy some items and try them everywhere. If you explore long enough, you'll find tons of secrets like heart containers or weapon upgrades, or hey, you might just bomb someone's front door. Wait, how do they even get out of their house? But hey, maybe exploring's not your thing. Maybe you're seeking a challenge and you just want to jump straight into dungeons. Well, luckily for you, you can tackle the first 8 levels in any order you like, especially since you probably won't find them in order. In fact, the world record speedrun holder, known as Darkwing Duck, starts with the 3rd dungeon, so you could try that, if you trust the terror that flaps in the night. However, some dungeons do require certain items to progress, so if you do get ahead of yourself, you're probably walking straight to your own demise. In short, the experience you have with the overworld really depends on the player. You can blast through the game in any pace you like, but at the same time, the game will thoroughly reward you for exploring, and as a result makes it a lot easier for you to complete. But these dungeons, well, let's just say they're not for the faint of heart. Despite the simplistic and rectangular look to them, each one has vicious enemies and puzzles waiting for you. Prepare to die a lot and to learn something new about the dungeons every single time. There's tons of passageways to find with hidden items. You can get hints from wizards about boss fights, as cryptic as they are, and most importantly, you can take all of this information in to create your own strategy. And that's really what made these dungeons stand out. Each dungeon felt fresh, and you had to think through each one in a very different way. Also, similar to Super Mario Bros., most enemies had their own personalities, with distinct attack patterns and weak points. And to top it off, the way to conquer these dungeons were extremely versatile, so every player came up with different solutions. There was no definitive way to win, but we'll get back to that later, because despite all this, and as Miyamoto intended, it's almost guaranteed you're going to get stuck. You're going to get frustrated, and if you weren't part of Nintendo Fun Club at the time, or you couldn't call the Nintendo Game Counselor hotline, yes, that actually existed, you had another tool, the manual. Now I know what I said before, thanks to the way this game is structured, you'll eventually figure it out on your own, but in this case you'd really be missing out. Unlike today's games with digital manuals and virtual coins that get you freaking notebooks. Club Nintendo's pretty awesome, by the way. Manuals since the Atari days have been chock full of information, and Zelda is no exception. This manual goes on to explain everything you need to know about the underworld and overworld in detail, every item in the game, a tutorial up to the second dungeon, and most importantly, descriptions of all the main enemies and bosses. The booklet's riddled with hints too, so it's worth it to pay attention to the fine prints. Attack Goma's weak point with a special weapon. Dig Doggers shrivel up when attacked. These pictures show some hints about the labyrinth. Oh, that is a swastika! So now that you're armed with knowledge, ready to kick Ganon's butt and know the structure of the Miyamoto household, it's time to go over its impact! Now as you might have guessed, with such innovative gameplay and the fact it's one of Nintendo's main series, the game was a smash hit and sold over 6 million gold-painted units. But you see, what made Zelda influential was way beyond just the gameplay, so let's go over what that is. First off, there was the commercials, with the infamous Zelda rap,
are pretty bad. Off your rocks, tech tags,
and this guy. You know, the funny thing about these commercials is that this is actually Nintendo going all out. Their budgets could go up to $5 million, which is 4 to 5 times higher than normal ones at the time. And since there weren't that many Nintendo games back then, each one really had to count. But somehow this craziness worked, and Nintendo continued to make these quirky commercials for many more years. Some better than others. There was also the inclusion of the second quest, a feature eventually used in many other Zelda games, with secrets hidden in completely different places, rearranged dungeons that actually spell Zelda, which is kinda cool, and just making the game harder in subtle ways, like multiple boss fights in the same dungeon, oh god! But the most interesting thing about them is that it was created off of an accident. You see, Tezuka admitted that when they finished the game, they only used half of the cartridge's memory space, so instead of just shipping it out as is, they decided to make this ridiculously hard second quest, where you'll learn to hate these guys a lot. Third up was the music, composed by Koji Kondo, who was also responsible for the Super Mario Bros. Soundtrack. It may not sound like much today, but back in the days where NES music mostly sounded like this, or this, oh god, make it stop. This soundtrack was just awesome. You see, Kondo always strives to make a soundtrack that can never get repetitive. He'll literally just sit in his chair and listen to his own music for hours on loop, and if he doesn't get sick of it in that time, he believes he succeeded. And since a lot of Zelda songs loop every, 40 seconds? That's a pretty amazing accomplishment, and I'd say millions of gamers and many other music remixers influenced by Zelda would agree. There is a battery save inside the cartridge, or disc if you had the disc system, which, big surprise, lets you save the game. Unlike the days where you had to put some long 30-something character password in. Okay, I'll stop picking on you now. Zelda lets you jump right back into action while not having to keep your console on overnight, only to realize your parent or guardian turned it off the next morning. Yeah, I know that happened to all of you. And as I was saying earlier, there was no definitive way to beat the game, and therefore people made speedruns with different rules, such as having 3 hearts only, no sword or the wooden sword only, or just beating it 100%. This game would go on to be one of the most popular speedrun games in history, and help birth this pastime in the gaming community. But despite all this praise, we still have one question to go over. How does this game hold up today? Well, honestly, it depends on your level of patience. You see, the problem with the game that redefines the genre is that, over the years, people try to add more to the formula. Game developers made adventure games more accessible. There were so many sequels to the series that advanced the Zelda formula. And the graphics, well, let's just say the later NES games trumped them by quite a bit. But if you go in the game with everything I told you in mind, the miniature garden Miyamoto made, the features the game became known for, and the origins of the genre up until this game, I personally think you'll still have a blast with it. So despite what the sequel may have brought, Zelda 1 has remained a slightly aged classic, so get it on your 3DS, Wii U, Game Boy Advance, whatever, and give it a go and see what you think. This has been the history of The Legend of Zelda, and you have been educated. So until next time, I gotta figure out how to put these back on my keychain. I blame you. Hey everyone, and thanks for watching this video. I'd like to give a huge shout out to my friend Nico for helping me out with all the graphics in this segment, so big thanks to him, and you should check him out on Twitter to see all his other projects. I really could not have done this project without him, so big thanks again. And as for my next projects, I have another Nintendo 101 coming up very soon of Super Smash Bros, so stay tuned for that. So in the meantime, if you like what you see, be sure to like, subscribe, whatever, and I'll see you guys next time with more videos. Adios! A lot!